Okay, thank you to everyone for registering and coming out today. IDPA is excited to collaborate with the Charter Cities Institute and some of our favorite Harris professors and present an engaging discussion. Just to give a quick overview of the agenda for today, we'll briefly introduce today's participants and then go into a presentation of the CCI team's work. We'll then shift to a panel discussion format with Professors Robinson and Sanchez de la Sierra, and we'll make sure to leave some time for audience questions as well. So starting off with our first panelist, Thompson is a researcher at the Charter Cities Institute. His work includes the creation of the New Cities Map, the first global data set of all new cities projects since 1945, and he's currently assisting the Zanzibar Investment Promotion Authority draft a strategic plan. Before CCI, Tommie worked on impact evaluations, randomized control trials, and behavioral economics. Jeffrey Mason is head of research at the Charter Cities Institute. His research interests include urban economics, structural transformation, special economic zones, and technology ecosystems. He has worked on policy advisory projects for governments, city developers, and special economic zone operators in Nigeria, Tanzania, Zambia, and Honduras, among other countries. Professor James Robinson is the Reverend Dr. Richard L. Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies and Director at the Pearson Institute here at Harris. An economist and political scientist, Professor Robinson has conducted influential research in the field of political and economic development and the relationships between political power and institutions and prosperity. His work explores the underlying causes of economic and political divergence, both historically and today. Professor Raul Sanchez de la Sierra is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy and a faculty affiliate at the Pearson Institute. His research tackles problems in the economics of development, political economy, and conflict. He conducts most of his research in areas of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the central state is especially weak. Thank you all for being here today, and we'll move on to the presentation.
All right, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Tommie, and today we'll be talking about charter cities. So this is the agenda for the presentation. And I always like to start off by talking about the policy problem. What is it that charter cities are trying to solve? Over the past 200 years, the world has become a much richer place as fewer people live in extreme poverty. In just the past 40 years, the global share of people living in poverty, extreme poverty, has gone from 70% to just 36%. But these gains have not been distributed equally across the world. If we look into it, China accounts for a large share of the gains in poverty reduction. At the extreme poverty level, at the $1.90 threshold, that China accounts for nearly half of our poverty alleviation. If we go up to the $10 threshold, which is at the lower end of an upper middle income countries, China accounts for nearly 70% of our reduction in poverty. And so what it starts to look like, this narrative of the world becoming more prosperous over the past 40 to 60 years, is really just a narrative of how Asia and China specifically became more prosperous. I have a couple of graphs to show this, but you see here that East Asia, the number of people living in extreme poverty has fallen dramatically over the past few years. In Sub-Saharan Africa, it hasn't really changed that much, and it's even upticked a little. Look at the GDP per capita in Sub-Saharan Africa, it looks relatively similar to what it was in the 1960s. So the question is, why is that the case? Why was Asia able to industrialize and to prosper in such a short amount of time, but Sub-Saharan Africa still struggles despite all the effort we throw at it? And the answer is economic growth. Long-run sustained economic growth is the best way to lift people out of poverty. We can discuss the equity issues. Maybe some of it goes too much to the upper or the lower threshold, but writ large, economic growth is the best way to increase income help countries industrialize, to help countries alleviate poverty. But of course, that's not controversial by itself. The question is, how do we turn on the levers of economic growth? And the answer to that is good institutions. A lot of research shows that good institutions are the primary determinant for economic growth. When countries have good institutions, they grow. And when countries have bad institutions, they stagnate. And it's really through good institutions that East Asia was able to develop and grow so quickly. They implemented good institutions when it was needed, and they implemented the correct institution. And if we want Sub-Saharan Africa to have a similar development story, they need to have good institutions as well. And that's easier said than done, right? How do we implement good institutions? There are a lot of barriers impacting that. One is politics. There are a lot of local actors, elites, politicians that benefit from the status quo in many countries. And so they benefit from having bad institutions. And so it's in their interest to block implementation of good institutions. There's also the technical question of fit. What institution do we want to put into Sub-Saharan Africa? Can we really just take the Western institution and the Asian institution that we know work and just put it there and hope for it to work? So that's the policy problem. We want to spur economic growth. We know that good institutions encourage economic growth. And the question is, how do we implement good institutions in a place where it's very difficult to do so? And the solution we're pitching is charter cities. So what are charter cities? Simply put, charter cities are new cities with new rules. We go to a relatively undeveloped greenfield site where there are very few inhabitants. We build a new city completely from scratch. We empower that city with a special jurisdiction. We decentralize power with some power that may typically belong to the national government, so that it's empowered to make decisions. And within that jurisdiction, we put in good institutions. However we end up defining what good institutions are, we put it in there. The idea was first pitched by Paul Roman in 2009. And the general theory of change is that we want economic growth. Good institutions lead to economic growth, but it's difficult to implement good institutions. So rather than trying to change the national laws of the entire country and fighting all of the politics, let's just do it in one small area. Let's just carve out a city-sized area. Let's give it some special powers. Let's put the good institutions there and create a really effective island. I always like to think of charter cities as a second best policy, right? So the best policy would be just to implement good institutions on a countrywide scale. But since we can't do that, we can try the smaller approach. And there are many benefits for the whole country. Ideally, this city would be very effective, and it would drive economic growth for the country as a whole. It would also generate positive spillover. But charter city can also be the lab of policy experimentation. National governments tend to be hesitant to make large reforms at a country level scale, but they can try these reforms in a smaller area first. And if it works, then expand it to a larger area. And this has largely been how China, through the SEV program, was able to develop. When Paul Romer pitched the idea, he's conceived of a Hong Kong model. His primary concern was how to make sure a charter city is not expropriated by the host country, prevent the host country from coming in and just taking all the resources from the charter city when it's successful. And so he pitched designating a third-party country, a country like Denmark, like Sweden, like Singapore, that we believe manage well. And they would oversee, manage, and protect the charter city from the host country's expropriation. And as I say that, you should have some alarm bells ringing, because that sounds very close to colonialism. And in fact, his inspiration was Hong Kong pre-1997, which were still a colonial subject by the British, were controlled and protected by the British. And the British were able to ensure that it maintained its good institution. The furthest Romer got to implementing this project was in Honduras. Honduras has a charter cities legislation, the only country with a charter cities legislation called the DEDI laws. There are 3 cities under that law, but the program had a lot of difficult issues and controversies. Eventually, Romer and his team stepped down, and the current presidential administration had voted to repeal the law. And right now, that repeal is waiting to be ratified. But it seems like in Honduras, the only place where charter cities would kind of try their experiment with it seems like it's about to end. But you can see how this policy is very controversial, right? And for that reason, Paul Romer authority stepped back from it. And then enters CCI. So We saw the idea and we wanted to revive it. We believe in the core idea. We believe that good institutions lead to economic growth. And we believe the best way to implement good institutions in countries where it's difficult to have institutional reform is to do so in a smaller jurisdiction and then to expand it from there. But rather than looking to Hong Kong as for inspiration, we looked to Shenzhen. In the 1970s, China designated 4 special economic zones. These are not small zones, they were large city-sized zones. In those zones, China rapidly urbanized it. They gave them special jurisdictional power, and those cities helped drive Chinese GDP growth for the latter half of the 20th century. And what differs from the Shenzhen model is that in Shenzhen, China owned the project completely. So it's all driven internally by the country. They had sovereign control over all of the cities, and there was no foreign control. And so that's the model the CCI is pitching. But of course, we can't just, China is a different country than the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. So we can't just take that model and implant it exactly. When China was still very poor, it still had relatively high state capacity. So their state was able to drive such a large institutional reform project. In sub-Saharan Africa, states have less capacity. So what we are proposing is a public-private partnership, where a country in sub-Saharan Africa would go into partnership with a private developer, and they would together manage and implement the charter city. Right, so that might all sound good in theory, right? Really, we're just trying to do this kind of micro-institutional reform in a small area and then expand it later on. But is that idea practical? And so we get a lot of questions at CCI about the practicality. So these are 3 of the things that I think are brought up a lot, so I just want to touch on them really quickly. And the first is new cities. Can and should we build them? Or can we? Yes, we can. This is the new cities map. It's a database and map that CCI created. It documents every master plan city from 1945 to the present. And all of these cities are built to accommodate a population of 100,000 people or more. So these are very large projects. You can see a lot in East Asia. That's because when Asia was rapidly developing in the second half of the 20th century, they built a ton of new cities to accommodate their demographic shift. Most of the new cities boom today, over the past 20 years, are taking place in Africa and the Middle East. You have probably heard of some of the big new city projects that are coming out of the Gulf and Saudi Arabia. The reason is because of rapid urban growth. Africa is undergoing an urban transformation the same way Asia did 40 years ago. Over the next 30 years, Africa will add about 1 billion people to its city, which is equivalent to 100 megacities. These are just some facts I pulled out from the new city database and map. But I just wanted to try and highlight that building new cities from scratch is completely feasible. It might seem unusual in the West, but in the global South, it's very much a standard policy that a lot of governments are engaging with. But just because we can build new cities, that means we should. And to answer that, let's go back to the cities of sub-Saharan Africa. So there are 2 things I want to mention. First, that sub-Saharan African cities are very poorly designed. They're very fragmented. They're very costly. In fact, cities in sub-Saharan Africa are the most expensive cities to live in the world, given their income level. And it's also very costly to fix those problems and to retrofit. One of the consistent things we find in economic history is that as countries and areas urbanize, they become more productive. As you can see in the top right, that's not happening in Africa. They're becoming more urbanized, but that urbanization is not translating to economic productivity. And that's because their cities are not conducive to leveraging population growth to economic productivity. The second issue is urban hierarchy. Africa has the most centralized urban hierarchy in the world. And by that, I mean in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, but also in other places in the global South, there really is just one main city that everybody has to go to for economic opportunity. If we think of Kenya, if you need economic opportunities, you go to Nairobi. In Senegal, you go to Dakar. And the reason that exists is because of former colonial policy. A lot of colonial governments try to artificially boost the growth and prosperity of just the capital city. And those are lingering today. And so that's not good for many of these countries because it doesn't distribute economic development across the entire region. It just concentrates it in one place. And so many countries, governments in Africa acknowledge this problem. And they're trying to build new cities to try to encourage more equitable development. So you read a lot of the Vision 2050 or whatever plans of these countries, they'll include new cities. So how does charter cities fit in? I think first, the new city wave presents an opportunity. Whether we think new cities should be built or not, doesn't matter, they're going to be built. And they can be used to create charter cities. But second, I think charter cities could help many of these new city projects do better because we can decentralize power to them. We can make them more empowered and we can help them translate economic population growth to economic growth. Second thing is expropriation. So our model, the PPP model, doesn't have a foreign guarantor. So there's a question of political risk. What prevents the host country from taking over the charter city? The answer is really nothing. Right? Political risk can never be removed. And at CCI, we believe we need to work with local partners and government officials. We need to get their buy-in. We need to make sure that their vision is aligned to the charter city vision, to the economic growth model that we're pitching. We also think we should align incentives. We can do that through the PPP structure to make sure that all the parties are aligned to the same goal. And there isn't really as much of an incentive for the whole country to take over the charter city when it starts succeeding. And I want to emphasize that that may not be as crazy as it sounds. In many cases, governments have been willing to decentralize some of their power for the sake of development. You see that in sub-Saharan Africa with special economic zones, countries are willingly creating these zones and giving them some powers. We see this with the various decentralization projects that are done over the past 20 years. There's a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot in Latin America, where countries are willingly decentralizing their national power to the local level because they think it would be better policy. The last thing I want to touch on just briefly is the question of inclusion. If we're pitching a public-private partnership model, there's going to be a private actor, and they need to profit for it to be worth it. And the problem with that is you can't really profit when you're catering just to low-income residents. You have to cater to high-income residents and middle-income residents, at least at the beginning stages of the project, so that you can recruit the investment. And so that creates a risk that some of these projects will just become these playgrounds for the very wealthy. With issues of displacement, all large infrastructure projects will displace people. In the charter cities model, we talk about greenfield development. But the reality is there are no greenfield development. Nowhere we're building today has no community claim to it right now, right? So no matter what large infrastructure project we do, it's going to affect some local group. And the third question is that, again, of colonialism, not just from the foreign guarantor perspective, but even from the PPP perspective. Because you can have unbalanced negotiation relationships in which the private developer typically Western and to have more negotiating power than less capacity in local government. This is just a recent article from the New York Times where they were discussing a project in Latin America and about inclusivity. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff now. Go over some of the ways that we can address some of these inclusion issues.
All right. Thank you, Tommie. So some of these questions that Tommie just raised, right? I think these are things that when we see things like the NEOM project in Saudi, for instance, right, it raises these important questions about new cities and charter cities. And, you know, these aren't the projects that maybe get the most attention, but are actually good projects on the ground that are trying to answer some of these very questions that Tommie's raised and that we've worked with in a number of capacities. And so that's what I'll talk a bit about. And so first answering some of those questions, I'd like to highlight these three specifically to start. So one, Ciudad Morazan, this is a charter city project organized under that original Honduran law. And while folks may have declared the project in Honduras called Prospera, right? That's kind of focused on high income workers, digital nomads, that kind of thing. Morazan, on the other hand, is looking at the ordinary Honduran, somebody who just wants an affordable, safe place to live with access to jobs, and that's what they're providing. Right? Maybe this at this price point, maybe you're not reaching the exact very bottom rung, but you're at a price point here where, you know, the average someone working, a working family in Honduras, this is actually something that becomes feasible for a family like that. And they're working on expanding that as well. And so some of our team was there about a month or two ago, and got to speak with some of the folks there. And this is really one of the only types of projects in a place like Honduras where you can get a sort of safe, stable community that isn't just gated and is exclusive to the well-off in Honduras. And alongside that, they're working on creating jobs in light industry, logistics. They're in the heart of Honduras's manufacturing industry region. So there's a lot of natural synergies there. A second project that we think gets at some of these questions really well is a project called Small Farm Cities, Malawi. So what they're essentially doing is pairing greenhouse agriculture and fish farming, aquaculture, these kind of things with super low cost, hyper affordable housing. With the price points driven down to the point that a family earning $75, $100, $125 a month can actually afford not just renting, but actually to own the home that's available there. All right, we're talking about things that are very basic, but they're planned in such a way that right, as you earn more, right, you can expand, you can build on these things, and actually create again this idea of a sort of functional community. There are municipal services, there are good jobs available, and like these plots, for example, because they're doing agriculture, they also include some private space for the families, not just the greenhouse. So right, if you're working this plot that comes with your house, that you're actually right there is you're paying your mortgage, and they've had a relentless drive on how can we push the price point of housing down even further while still providing a good quality product that's accessible to the average person in Malawi. And then a third project that I think gets at some of these issues of especially of housing is Town in Zanzibar, and this is where we're devoting a lot of our effort, and I'll speak a little bit more about it later. But right, in most of Sub-Saharan Africa, there's really not any sort of mortgage market, right? It's difficult to access credit financing for something like a house, and we're working with them on a number of projects, but one of them is looking at what kind of financing schemes for folks in that community who would like to live in Town to pool risks, in the absence of you can just go to the bank and get a mortgage. And so creating these alternatives when the sort of broader institutional structures that we all have easy access to don't really exist. So looking back to what are some of the precedents for this? We cite these types of examples. Some of these Tommie has talked about already. Again, not as to say, right, do this, and this verbatim, what these places did, but instead that there are generalizable lessons that you can learn when you're thinking about a charter city project today from these past experiments. So, right, I think everybody kind of knows the story of sort of the merchant republics of Italy. And there's been some interesting work about how, right, there's sort of longstanding effects of those. The Hanseatic League in sort of medieval Northern Europe, right? They sort of adopted these common legal frameworks across jurisdictions to facilitate trade and coordination across these city-states. Tommie's talked a little bit about SEZs and special economic cities in China. Right, Singapore, I think, is a very important story about quality governance, good governance, and actually investing heavily in the ability of the state to actually sort of deliver on the things that you need to generate markets and generate growth. And Dubai is an interesting story, I think, that often gets overlooked. Right, we think of the shiny buildings and all that. But there's actually a very interesting story there about taking these sort of over time, these well-calculated, large strategic bets. Right, they started with ports and free zones, and then gradually moved into other things. Right, they didn't follow the path of their neighbors and just go all in on oil. Right, they didn't have that luxury or curse. So again, we bring these examples up not to say, again, do these things verbatim, but there are these important lessons for the new cities that, as Tommie showed earlier, they are getting built today. That's worth thinking about, and that's something that we're trying to impart to these city developers, whether they're private sector or governments. There's important precedents to think about that they might not be. Other examples, there's a number of sort of purely privately developed cities. This is a picture of Gurgaon in India. Essentially started up by a number of firms in sort of India's tech sector and other businesses. I think they have since, after some time has passed, it did establish a municipal government. Right, this was essentially a private creation, and it actually worked better, more functional than other cities in India, and it scaled to a quite large degree doing so. And Martin Rama and Yue Li at the World Bank, they've done a lot of really interesting research on private cities throughout the global South, both, relatively successful cases like Ergowan, as well as, some of those sort of white elephant type projects as well. But there are some very interesting private cities out there that show that this kind of model can work. And then there's other types of adjacent projects that maybe they aren't necessarily new city projects per se, but I think they impart important lessons for thinking about urban expansion more generally. World Bank had this project called Sites and Services, trying to address the issue of slums, and they were essentially doing neighborhood planning, things like, right of way, basic services, these kind of things, designating, where plots are, introducing some order to urban expansion. Right, because if there's no order to urban expansion, which is going to happen anyway, it becomes much more difficult to go back in later and retrofit and provide the services. And unfortunately, at the time, it was deemed a failure. But then looking back on it later, it seems like it was actually quite successful in a number of different places in sort of achieving its ends. And we've seen similar efforts more recently put forward by the Marin Institute at New York, these types of urban expansion initiatives, most notably in Ethiopia, but other places too. I think there's a lot of smart folks thinking about, how do we actually handle this issue of rapid urban growth? And right, even if we're not thinking about something like planning for urban expansion of an existing area, right, that's not maybe formally a new city, but in a sense, you almost are creating a new city if you're actually going in and laying out grids and plots and these kind of things, that you're introducing some order to something that's going to happen regardless, but would otherwise be in a pretty disordered fashion. And that has all kinds of downstream effects that I think Tommie touched on earlier. And then we'll wrap up here by talking about a couple of CCI's projects and partnerships and some of the things we're doing to build the ecosystem for charter cities. And so I think in a charter city project, broadly speaking, there's sort of three principal actors, three principal roles. And there's significant overlap. These categories aren't wholly discrete. But you need, for a charter city project organized, as a PPP, you need government. As Tommie talked about, right, somebody has to, right, the government has to be willing to say, yes, affirmatively, yes, we are going to devolve authority to this jurisdiction. We're going to provide supporting, infrastructure, connectivity. We're going to delegate the appropriate personnel, right? If we're going to allow you to, say, run your own one-stop shop for business registration and those kind of things, right? You're going to have the personnel and authorities to, approve what you need to approve without having to go back, to the ministry of whatever, right? I set these jurisdictions up for success, as well as providing oversight of the projects and these jurisdictions. And right, most of these laws that have been passed creating charter cities or something like them. There's a ministry that's ultimately responsible, a commission. Some embedded unit in government is ultimately responsible for oversight. The second key player is the private developer, the city developer. And this is where I think it makes the most sense. This is who should be bearing the sort of hard financial costs of building a new city, because they have the best incentives for that, right? Government, if government can do this, but the incentives for essentially making sure that city kind of passes the market test is a lot less weaker than if you're dealing with the developer, who they can't just endlessly pour money into it if it's not actually, people aren't going to live there, businesses aren't going to invest there. And so I think the incentives are best aligned that a private developer is doing roads, utilities, these kind of things. In some cases, right, building, there's different models. Some folks are sort of doing kind of a leasehold model, right? They're building things and leasing them out. In other cases, they're sort of creating the master environment where other folks can come in and do that. But I think the incentive problem is particularly important. And you can find publicly led projects in a number of countries where I think they've kind of run into this problem, where they poured money into it, but the project really, you can tell it's not passing the market test in terms of who's investing or who's living there. And then there's a third piece of this, and this is where, for the projects we work with that CCI comes in, is the soft infrastructure, thinking about what is the actual optimal institutional framework, the organizational structure of one of these types of projects, what kind of laws and regulations make sense for whatever the aims of the jurisdiction are, right? This is something that we try to think about quite a bit and internalize a lot of research and a lot of different lessons from a wide variety of city projects. And we're trying to pass that knowledge on to the city developers and the governments that are interested in these projects, but don't quite know, what's the best way forward for these. And so I'll talk about a couple of different places that we're working in. And I'll start with Zanzibar, and where we have a number of active projects. So the sort of master project for this, as I mentioned before, is called Fumba Town. This is a sort of mock-up of what it's eventually supposed to look like. There's a couple hundred units built now, but this is essentially south of the main town. In Zanzibar, I forget the exact figure. I think it's supposed to add another 1 million or 2 million urban residents over the next couple of decades. So even in a island setting like Zanzibar, right, there's still rapid urbanization. It's included within an SEZ that we're looking to revise, sort of non-functional, but looking to expand that and say, how do we have this jurisdiction, how can we take this and use it for this project that wants to attract investment, wants to attract residents? How do we make this law work for this project, for this jurisdiction? A second piece of the Fumba Town project is the African School of Economics. So many of you, this is Leonard Wanchicon from Princeton. I think you guys were just in South Africa together. So he's the founder of the African School of Economics. They want to expand out of West Africa to East Africa, and they've decided to settle as part of the Fumba Town expansion as an anchor tenant for that, building their first East African campus. And so we're working with ASC on setting that up. They're also partnered with IIT Madras, so sort of India's MIT, who also just established a campus down the road from Fumba Town in Zanzibar. So there's this really exciting opportunity in Zanzibar to create this sort of hub for higher education, for tech. There's a growing tech presence on the island, and other services. And at the same time, channeling that investment into other things like aquaculture, light industry, tourism, other types of services. And then a third piece to the Fumba Town project and the ASE project is the Africa Urban Lab. So this is something that's going to be housed within the African School of Economics. And we're calling it as thinking of it as sort of an interdisciplinary teaching hospital, in the sense of a lot of urban practitioners, urban professionals in cities throughout sub-Saharan Africa. They really they are really not well equipped to, both on the capacity side, but also just in the training that they tend to receive. They're really not equipped to handle rapid urbanization at the scale that it's happening. And we'd like to better equip these practitioners, these policymakers, and therefore the cities in which they're working and living, with the tools to better respond to rapid urbanization. And so, in addition to material and things like urban development, urban planning, governance, regulation, these kind of things, we're also going to be looking to pair them up with some of our partner city projects, folks who go through these programs, to give them sort of hands-on experience working in a new city or in a rapidly expanding jurisdiction. A few additional things we're also doing in Zanzibar, as Tommie mentioned. We're working with the Investment Promotion Authority on their strategic plan. And we're also looking at policy reform in Zanzibar, more generally, what can be done to improve the SEZ regime, what can be done to facilitate investment in the target sectors that the government has said we'd like to facilitate. And then the third thing we're doing, some of you might be familiar with Vitalik Buterin's Zuzalu pop-up city. We're helping with a project that's doing a similar pop-up city effort. later this year in Fumba Town to generate interest and let folks know, look, here's what's going on here. Here's who's interested in living and investing and doing business in Zanzibar. And incorporating working local government, students from local universities, city builders in our network, and others to start building up this ecosystem in Fumba Town. The second place we're doing a lot of work is Nigeria. So Tommie talked about this kind of PPP model, where right, there's a role for government, there's a role for a city developer, and this project's called Enyimba Economic City in Abia State, that's southeastern Nigeria. Is about as close to that sort of model as you can get. So there's an active partnership between the lead developer, the federal government of Nigeria has an equity stake, the state government of Nigeria, of Abia State has an equity stake in Enyimba Economic City, as well as a local land trust in the area where they acquired their land. And then they went out and raised $200 million, mix of debt and equity from the Africa Export-Import Bank. And we think this is a really powerful signal that, right, this isn't just, these weird niche little projects popping up or, it's not just, right, something like NEOM, right? It's just bankrolled from, the state's oil revenue, something like that, right? We're talking about a massive scale project targeting 1.5 million people, raising several $100 million from a major financial institution in Africa. And they're targeting manufacturing, logistics, the energy sector services. A second project in Nigeria that we're working on is the Atana Digital Free Zone. So they're essentially, what they're trying to do is be sort of the Delaware for Africa. The idea that if you want to do business in Nigeria, in Africa more broadly, this jurisdiction is the best place to start to do that. And with the new Continental Free Trade Agreement area coming online, they can also kind of play the role, they're hoping to play the role that Estonia has played for the EU with its e-residency program. But they're also building a physical campus outside of Lagos to create a more viable hub for Nigeria's growing tech sector. Right, the energy and power infrastructure, the internet, it's not very reliable in Lagos. It's very crowded. They're at a real risk of losing local talent when they, if you're in that sector, right, they might have the ability to locate elsewhere. And they want to keep that talent locally in Nigeria. And so that's something that they're trying to facilitate. Another place that we're doing a lot of work, I mentioned small farm cities earlier. In addition to their sort of initial project focused on agriculture, they have an expansion plan. They're going to open a second project adjacent to what will soon be the world's largest titanium mine, where they're going to continue doing the agriculture, but they're also going to make investments in sort of the supporting industries that feed into the mining business. And so that first project was targeted for about 100 families. This one's going to be built much larger to accommodate 1,000 or more. So it's a significant expansion. And the second thing that we're doing there is a number of different policy reforms. So in December, Malawi passed an updated special economic zone regulation that was really, in a very sort of simple way, quite innovative. And it's going to require additional regulations for implementation. What they've done is and with our input is basically said, we're going to take that traditional special economic zone kind of industrial park model and say, we can also now declare an urban area or a secondary city as a special economic zone. And they've made the provisions for that. And they recognize the importance of urbanization for sort of Malawi's economic and development future. And they're thinking very seriously about how do we develop these sort of poles of secondary cities and use zones to do that. So that's something that we're helping with as well. And then a few other things. In Zambia, we're working on a similar zone reform effort to their package. And then there's a number of different both private and public projects under development, new city projects that we've worked with in some way or another. In Zambia, we talked a little about Honduras and Ciudad Morazan earlier. These are some photos from Morazan. And then in Kenya, this is more early stage, but they also have a secondary cities plan that we're looking into helping with. And they're also interested in turning some of their existing refugee camps into proper municipalities. which is another, I think, underexplored opportunity for charter cities. You have these camps, right? This original refugee camp model was not intended for sort of permanent use. Right, the idea is folks would temporarily resettle and go back home. But that basically doesn't happen anymore with refugee camps. They become these permanent settlements. They become cities without the actual legal municipal infrastructure to function as cities. So there's a significant opportunity there for charter cities to influence the future of refugee policy as well. So that's a little bit about what we're doing. You can find more about our research and other things at our website. We're always interested in working with interns, guest authors. So if these are topics that you're interested in, please reach out to Tommie and I. We'd love to work with you on this. And thank you. And we'll move into our discussion.
Should be green.
Okay. Right. This is main correlation to establish causation.
We can also keep this for you. All right. So thank you so much, Tommie and Jeff, for that overview. I think we're going to transition now into more of an open conversation where we can get the professor's reaction to some of the content that was walked through and dig into some questions on feasibility, whether there's buy-in for the charter cities model. So Professor Robinson, maybe we can start with you. I think all of us in this room know that you're a pretty firm believer in the growth potential of good institutions. So do you think the charter cities model is practical, and maybe a little bit more specifically, do you think that LDC governments would be more receptive to importing good institutions within these special jurisdictions that we've been talking about?
Yes, I mean, I think it's nice to see people focusing on institutions, but I'm not sure I understand what the charter city model is, honestly, after that presentation. I mean, you know, for me, like, I would like to start by disagreeing with my friend Ken Opalo, you know, about the road to development is going to be sticking people in big factories. And I don't believe that at all, actually. That's not how Africa is going to develop. You know, it'll be something completely different. It'll be something, it won't be making stuffed toys and, you know, iPhones, and it'll be using what Africa is good at, you know, the creativity, the culture, taking over world sport, taking over world entertainment industry. You know, it'll be something different and surprising. You know, like my favorite example at the moment is not African actually, but it's Peruvian, you know, but one of the most successful companies in Peru started in like Ayacucho, which is like up, you know, in the Sierra. And during the Civil War, and, you know, a businessman noticed that, you know, the people were robbing the Coca-Cola trucks and stuff. So people in the highlands didn't have any Coca-Cola and stuff like that. So they said, okay, great, let's start making soda. But they made cheap soda, you know, and they decided, okay, we're going to make cheap soda and we're going to have it for everybody at a fair price. So they're going to democratize soda. Okay, you see where this is going. Cola Real is called. Okay, and then what did they do? Where did they expand? Well, you can't buy Cola Real in Berlin or Amsterdam, but you can buy it in Nigeria, actually, and you can buy it in Indonesia. So it was a sort of south-south model of let's sell stuff to poor people. You know, let's sell stuff to the, you know, to the poor people in the informal sector in the country town in Lima, and that's what people learn. They have this disgusting, but it's cheap and it's popular. And that's what's going to happen. You know, it's the south-south model of development, and you know, well, that's where it's going to come from. So I, you know, obviously I like the idea of improving institutions, but I wonder, you know, going forward, you know, I mean, I wonder in academia, you know, going forward in 50 years' time, how is academic research going to happen? You know, in this world of computer science and AI and are there gonna be people like me sitting with paper and pencil solving dynamic programming problems or like? I doubt it, I doubt that at all, and I doubt that development's gonna look like that either, and I wonder whether, we know enough about what development is gonna do to kind of plan it in this utopian way, like if you ask me, what's the problem in Latin America? Utopianism, like think about Brasilia, think about like there's always this idea of like planning and organizing, and it never works out, reality always resists, there's a disconnect between the real and the ideal. So I worry, this is what I worry about. Like, and I was thinking, when you were talking, I'll shut up, I'm gonna talk too much. But like talking about cities in Nigeria, have you been in Lagos? There is a big city, it's called Echo Atlantic City. There's a big white elephant sitting on Victoria Island that, President Tinubu was heavily involved, and it's like sitting there. What's happening with that? So before you start talking about building these cities in Abia State, I'd like to know, it would be good to know, I don't know the answer, you guys probably do know the answer, like what went wrong with Echo, talking of white elephants, what wrong with it? Seemed like it's in the middle of Lagos, like the world is its oyster, it's gonna be fabulous, but it wasn't, so why is that? And when I thought of, I'm always gonna shut up, sorry, when I thought also about cities in Africa, who's building new cities in Africa? President Al-Sisi is building a new city, 50 kilometers east of Cairo. Why is he doing that? To control people and make sure that he doesn't get kicked out of power the way President Mubarak got kicked out of power. They're building a new city in Equatorial Guinea, in the mainland. Why are they doing that? Same reason. They built a new city in Myanmar. Why? Same reason. They're building a new capital in Borneo, in Indonesia. Why? Same reason. So I see, like, and it's interesting how you have these illiberal models, like Dubai, China, yeah, they sort of cracked how you could develop and keep control of everything. And yeah, they built cities, and it's sort of remarkable what's happened in the UAE. But I also wonder, gosh, is that what we're heading for? Is that what we're aiming at? Like, kind of this, maybe the whole world is being taken over by these illiberal successful models of development. But that's not kind of my idea of promoting institutional reform or a kind of more inclusive society. I don't know, it used to be, I was at a discussion last week with Timur Karan about, his view about the development, the long-run development of the Middle East. And, it could be that we used to think that, we could have our cake and eat it, that we could have liberal society and inclusive political and social institutions. And we got economic development too as well. And that's kind of the argument of why nations fail. But the intellectual kind of ambience seems to be moving away from that at the moment, which I find sort of fascinating. But I wonder how that fits into your project as well. Their cities are not promoting inclusive institutions en masse. Maybe they're dovetailing to some illiberal, relatively non-inclusive, at least in some dimensions. I mean, the genius of the Chinese model is that they've managed to combine a lot of inclusion in the economic sphere with very extractive institutions in the political sphere. Whether that's sustainable or not, I don't know. But anyway, that was just some thoughts I have. Sorry.
Is that a question for me? Or-
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good.
Okay, you would be good for that. Yeah.
Yeah, and Professor Sanchez de la Sierra, we do want to hear your thoughts as well, but maybe before we dive into another specific question, I want to give the CCI team a chance to maybe respond to some of the questions that Professor Robinson raised about maybe what went wrong in Nigeria, or if you just want to give some clarifying inputs on, the end-to-end model to kind of spur the discussion along, feel free to do so.
Sure, a few thoughts. I'll keep it quick. Yeah, I think a project like Echo Atlantic, right? I think it's about as close to as big of a missed opportunity as you can possibly have, right? It's, if you're going to build a new city in Nigeria, that's about as prime of a location as you could put it. But right, I think if you try to ask the question, right, if you're going to build something, I don't remember the figures off the top of my head, but at the price points of what something like Echo Atlantic is offering people, who's it affordable for? right? It's maybe a very small number of people in a city of what is Lagos now, over 12 million, 15 million, something like that. It's right. It's a huge city. But you're building something that's completely missing the largest possible market that you could have for it. So yeah, I think these projects, especially, right, you can build something like that in the UAE, whatever, great. There's a market for that there. But yeah, I mean, I agree. In a country like Nigeria, where most people cannot even come close to affording something like that, I think it's frankly it's a waste of what could be a really good opportunity. And so that's why I think, those projects, they're going to keep happening. And that's unfortunate. I think our input is just to say, look, there are better ways you could be doing this. And by focusing on pushing down the price point, focusing on creating jobs that are actually accessible to the local population, these kind of things. That's how you plant the seeds for a more successful new city. Right. The magic of why a city works isn't because of, it's shiny buildings, right? That's a byproduct of success, right? That's not, you can't start from there. So yeah, I think, we're in agreement that those types of projects, it's not a good use of anyone's time and effort. Just a second thing I would add, on sort of the point about, liberal versus illiberal models. Again, I agree, right? Right, all those, right, you mentioned all the Egyptian new cities, right? We see those on the new cities map. Again, I would just say, like Tommie talked about, these projects are going to happen. Our input is to try to say, look, let's use these for better ends. And I think looking at the Chinese case, right, it's an interesting question, because the initial, the zones that they tried out in Shenzhen and elsewhere, it's this interesting decentralization. I think you could arguably call it a political liberalization, at least that's how it started, within a very centralized system, in terms of, okay, in Shenzhen, local officials, you guys are going to try this stuff out, figure out what works. You have the autonomy to keep doing it. If it doesn't work, right, you guys can toss it out. So I think there's an additional layer of depth in that particular case that I think is interesting. But again, I agree that, yeah. Are we good? Sure. No, and I would just say that, I agree that I think these types of projects, given that they're organized around some degree of decentralization, are best organized if they are going in a liberal direction. And that a project that is fundamentally illiberal in nature is like something like an Echo Atlantic, I think is constitutionally going to go in the direction of making the same mistakes.
Great, thank you for those clarifying thoughts, Jeff. And Professor Sanchez, we will go to you now. We know that your research focuses on weak state settings. And Tommie talked through the fact that CCI's public-private partnership model was really designed to replicate China's success, as we've talked about with these special economic zones and low state capacity settings. So what are your thoughts on the success of the PPPs in these contexts? And we welcome your more general thoughts as well, of course.
Try with this one.
try that.
Yeah, no, it works. Okay. Okay, so I'm new to the idea of charter cities. What I want to do is to, rather than challenge you, go with you and talk through some of the challenges that come to my mind when I think of policy making in quote unquote weak states. Before that, maybe I want to say that I think a lot of the discussion is not specific to charter cities or to new cities. It's just a question of what we think are good policies or development models. So maybe I want to focus on what's specific to the question of new charter cities. And so the first thing that comes to mind, I work in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Some of the people who have spent lots of time studying the conflict identify competing claims over land as one of the main drivers of the conflict. And so especially, that's a problem, especially in weak state settings. It's especially for charter cities. it's going to be very difficult to think of there's just free land that one can take. There's often communities that have norms about land. There's traditional chiefs that sometimes are not aligned with the communities. There is the state that is essentially the vestige of the colonial state creation. And so even trying to work with the existing state just because it sounds not colonial might actually be even more problematic than trying to avoid it. From the perspective of most Congolese, the state is everything but legitimate. It's just a predatory criminal organization that took power and announces who won the elections, even though everyone knows it's not true. So I think thinking creatively about what's the cultural and institutional environment where competing claims exist, and to start thinking about who are going to be the losers. Typically, in the mining sector, you have a lot of that charter cities emerging spontaneously with people being kicked out, leading to new militias, new conflicts of interests that I think are important to think about. One example, there's a Congolese organization that specializes in development. It's called Kivu Agro-Pastoral. They are from there. They work in places where the state actually is not present. And so they work with the existing communal norms of land ownership and land rights. Perfect. And there's a huge potential. For example, they were able to mobilize a large amount of voluntary labor who contributes to clear up communal land, and it's more harmonious to think of potentially spaces where the central state is not even present, because in many ways is the source of the problem. So public-private partnerships, I would think, like it's like informal institutions / perhaps private partnership, but I don't know if public is any good in a context where the state is not even legitimate. The other thing that came a little bit in the presentation is state weakness is also about the ability to commit. So any involvement of the central states implies the risks that they're not going to be able to easily commit not to expropriate the rents from the city, potentially stifling investment, because often individuals who control the state don't internalize long-term effect of that. There's many ways that this can happen. Border control, extortion along the roads, the creation of situation of siege. The central government has the power over water, electricity, infrastructure that makes the city quite vulnerable to abuse by the central government. I was asked also to think about weak state and conflict. So where I work is a bit of an extreme case, so take it with a grain of salt. It's not representative, but there's about 120 armed groups just in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So, cities are not isolated from the environment of the country. There are roads, thinking about the trade infrastructure, unless everything is shipped by airports, it depends crucially on the rest of the country as well, not just the central government, but, the creation of toll systems that can be quite distortionary is something to think about. So maybe, weak states might not be the best place to think about charter cities, except in places like the example I gave. In terms of something that's especially important in weak states is the ways that society organize informally. So culture and norms, structure, a disproportionately large share of what people do, as opposed to the kind of legal frameworks where in more state-centric places. So I think it's very important to think, again, in a post-colonial state like the Congo, where there's about 200 societies that pre-exist. Who is going to go to these cities? How are they going to live together? Should it be mixed or homogeneous? What kind of values people bring? One example of a colonial creation of a charter city is Lubumbashi, which didn't exist about 100 years ago. They found copper, so they created infrastructure to ship the copper away. And that created a huge number of issues because they brought people from Kasai to work with people from Katanga, leading to some sorts of ethnic segregation and ethnic conflict. So I think thinking very carefully, case by case, what kind of identities and moral frameworks people bring when we go to the cities is crucial. One way is that charter cities are presented. I think there's a continuum between good policy and charter cities, not necessarily something like completely new. It's just opportunities where maybe there's more margin to tilt policy than in places where it's already established. But one way is that Paul Romer presents them is like it gives choice. People can choose to move and politicians can choose to accept it. or not, and therefore that's great. But actually, I don't think it's true that people have choice. There's a large number of stakeholders who won't have choice, not only the people who were living on those land before, but there is a lot of externalities from people moving out of other cities. It's going to create losers. So landowners are going to see the value of land diminish. People who employ people in, let's say, industrial sectors are going to see wages go up. Municipal governments are going to see tax collections go down. So that also is something to think about, because it creates a coalition of people who are going to not just try to block it, but also endanger the promise of economic growth of that. And this is something that has been quite studied in the sub-Saharan African context and in Colombia. It's nothing specific to where I'm at, but the kind of creation of coalitions of winners and losers, especially in rural areas and in the cities. And I think, yeah, in terms of public-private partnerships, there's a lot of experience in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. One, for example, is Glencore. It's a private corporation. They also build infrastructure by creating kind of charter cities for the exploitation of minerals. They're also famous because the way they acquired the land is through extraordinarily large bribes by a businessman called Dan Gertler, who is now being prosecuted, or I don't know if it's over already, with using personal connections to the president, former President Kabila. The same with Chinese firms, Huayu and a bunch of others. The problem is the state is very vulnerable to extremely high levels of corruption that can actually destroy the value for society. Why? Maybe some of it is quote unquote weak institutions. Some of it is just the asymmetry of financial means of whatever the private corporations are. And, you know, thinking about the fact that it's private doesn't mean that their incentives are aligned. They want to make profit, and that's often not aligned with the population. That's a bit negative. So I want to talk about the opportunities, perhaps. In places where the state is not working for society, society finds very creative ways to live by. And so my experience in a place like Eastern DRC is a place where there's a huge innovative potential, a huge stock of talent that is sometimes channeled towards not socially productive ways because of the existing institutions. So I think in that regard, it's quite a special place to think about creating spaces of innovation. But thinking very carefully about how people think about working relationships or enforcement of contracts that often, you know, this boundary between laws, norms is very different. And there's always a risk of exporting laws and norms that don't fit. So I didn't say much, but I think, you know, in general, cities are being created constantly. So there's a question of, oh, this is an opportunity to kind of tilt the development of environments where there's more freedom, or even incentivize the creation of new cities. But again, it's part of a political context. And yeah, so that context is not very, very aligned with society often when it's about weak states. But so I ended negatively.
Thank you. And similarly, Tommie, Jeff, if you guys want to jump in on any of those points, I want to give you the opportunity to do so. Otherwise, we can just prepare to keep going for our list.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, touch on one thing, because you mentioned a lot of different things. I think there is a concern in low state capacity areas, whether the state can be trusted to commit to a program and whether they can be trusted to do things beneficial for society. And my concern is a lot of organizations in the social sector, they see that problem and they try to create these parallel institutions to the government. So they might just try to do everything internally as an NGO, the local community. And to me, that doesn't really strike me as development, because when you're developing, you have to involve the state at some point. And so I'm a little concerned that this approach to development, where even if you just believe the state is not worth working for or working with, you create these parallel institutions. I'm not really sure what the bridge is to go from there all the way back to involving the state at some point. Because 50 years from now or whatever, when we see hopefully a developed DRC, it's not going to be this combination of 20 or 30 different NGOs doing a bunch of things the state should be doing. It's going to be the state being involved in a similar way the state's involved in the West and in Asia. And it's for that reason I I like the CCI model where we try to involve the state as much as possible. I understand that there are risks to that. There's always political risk. But I don't really see a way forward unless development tries to involve the state in some capacity.
Great, thank you. So I think maybe along those lines, discussing state capacity, I think it's maybe interesting to go from there and talk about how we've discussed that charter cities are really intended to spur economic growth, but we've seen some instances in the past where this has failed. So again, along these lines of state capacity, I'm curious, and this is for anybody who wants to jump in, should we really try to get back into big push policymaking? And is that sort of the feasible way forward in this space, or how does anybody think about that?
You gonna start? I can start. Right, without, going full sort of Lant Pritchett on this, about, RCTs and that kind of thing versus big push. Although I would say I'm certainly sympathetic to that. I do think there is, and this gets a little bit, I think, what Tommie just said. More thinking about development. Is that are we actually? I'll back up for a second. One of our frequent collaborators, he has a phrase that he likes to say that systems problems require systems solutions, which is kind of, it's obvious, but when you apply it to the context of rapidly urbanizing countries with rapidly urbanizing low-income countries, that's a really chunky systems problem to try to solve. And this is what I think what Tommie kind of got at a little bit earlier, is that it's really hard to try to solve those problems in a meaningful, sustained, long-term way, by taking lots of little tiny bites at the problem, right? At the margins, I think, right, they're helpful. But I do think there is something to be said for something like big push, or if we're thinking of charter cities as sort of emblematic of big push, maybe it's taking a way to take a more reasonable bite at trying to do big push. Right, because at the end of the day, when we go and talk to we're talking to policymakers, regardless of, say, how well their country's special economic zone regime, for example, has done, right? Most of them in Africa are pretty middling. They appreciate and intuitively get the logic of, well, right, there's kind of this long-term SEZs have basically been industrial parks. We're doing this, we can see how we can make this work. Why shouldn't we be including things like residential and other types of uses in these zones as part of these policies that we're doing anyway? Why isn't that the natural evolution of what we've already been trying to do? So I think there is something to be said for big push, but perhaps doing it in a more gradual, incremental way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I do want to make sure we have time for some audience questions as well. But before we do that, professors, I want to give you both the chance to maybe sort of extend some of the criticisms that you have brought to us today. And just want to ask how you would reformulate the charter cities theory of change to be more effective, if at all. Wondering if you have any ideas on that.
I was just, I think the way I think about what Professor Sanchez de la Sierra was saying is like, these are just extremely difficult problems. Like, we don't have a good characterization, really, of the problems of development and the political economy of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's extremely difficult to understand many things that go on. We can understand some of the mechanisms and incentives. So nobody has a magic wand for that, So I think it's good to be creative and think of new ideas. And I think, I'm sympathetic to the view that, most development economics is completely irrelevant, for dealing with these problems. But I guess like where I would differ is really, if you look at every single development success story, ever, you know, everyone needs help. You know, I need help. You know, we all need help. Africans need help. Nigerians need help. But ultimately, they'll be the ones that figure out how to do it. You know, why has Rwanda grown so rapidly for the past 30 years? Was that some outsiders? No, it was not. What about Ethiopia under Meles Zenawi? You know, what about China? You know, what about Singapore, for example? What about South Korea, where everything President Park tried to do in the 1960s and 1970s was told by the World Bank and everybody else this was unviable, it was irrational, it would never work, and it did work. So he couldn't have a steel industry. He got a steel industry. He couldn't have a shipbuilding industry. He got a shipbuilding industry. So I don't know how President Park figured out that that was going to work, or he could do it, or he just went for it. And it could have failed. I think it's fine if things fail. You know, like I think this Honduras example, for example, I think that's completely fine that that failed. Of course, you're going to experiment. You're bound to fail. So I don't think that's actually a kind of negative about charter cities at all. I think I like the ambition, you know, and I admire Paul Roma for doing that, you know, because he had no professional incentive to stick his neck out and do that. His professional incentive was to sit in his office and solve dynamic programming problems. But he didn't, that wasn't enough for him. He wanted to change the world. And even if he looked like a fool. So I think that's actually fabulous. I really admire him for that. And I respect him for it also. So I like that. I like big ideas. But I guess I would like to see more. You know, where is the voice of the South here? Where are the, you know, like, what do the Africans think about this? Like, think about Nigeria, you know, southern Nigeria, northern Nigeria has a long history of urbanization of great urban cities all over Yoruba land. It was a highly urbanized society. Benin, you know, the north, Kano, you know, like, okay, how can we learn something from that about urban areas and about how cities work in Africa and what the challenges are and, you know, the types of things that Professor Sanchez de la Sierra were talking about in terms of kind of ethnic heterogeneity, or how do we manage that? And so you know, that's kind of my take.
Okay. I don't know why. Okay. I think I want to follow up on what you said and jump on the wagon to push back a little bit on this idea that the solution to creating parallel structures is actually working with the state. You know, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that a lot of NGOs after the 90s were very skeptical about working with the state. It was coming from an intellectual background in the 80s of mistrusting the state, dismantling the state globally. And so they started creating parallel structures, which were not only not democratic, they also didn't work to achieve whatever goals people wanted to achieve with that. But the solution is not to work with the state. There are societies there that have been living for millennia, and the state is just one of a dozen different actors. I think the willingness to work with the state, with a discourse that this is because what people want or it's inclusive, is a mistake. It's legalistic. There's an international state system that recognizes the legitimacy of existing states, but that's a bunch of other organizations in the globe that say the DRC is a state. When you go to places like Kivu, there are traditional chiefs, there's kingdoms, there is social movements, there is associations that have existed forever. In fact, the least legitimate one, the one that represents the least of people, is the central state. And I think it's a mistake to go with the state just because it sounds like it's the legitimate authority that people have. That's why I say that I'm going to work with you to try to think carefully of what are the challenges that one would like to solve. So the next step of community-driven development, for example, which are the parallel structures, is not necessarily to work with the state. In the long run, who knows if the state will be there? It's like 80 years old, was created by the Belgians, and people have a Congolese identity, but they have a very decentralized way of conceiving their identity as well, and they perceive the central state as predatory, essentially. So just following up, it's a very complex problem, and taking seriously into account people's agency, culture, and worldviews is important. And it doesn't follow from that in weak states, one wants to work with them. It's more colonial, in fact. Yeah. So just, I think it's a great idea. So just pushing back, saying beyond the state, there's a lot more than one should include. Might not be legal, but.
Thank you. Yeah, super interesting ideas. And with that, since we do have a few minutes left, I do want to take some time to open it up to the audience if anybody has questions to bring. Lisa, can I ask you to bring the mic back?
Yeah.
Hola. So I have a strong bias, and I'll admit it straight up. I protested against charter cities in Honduras, and I'm going to protest them here. But I did come with an open mind. I really try to understand all of it, but I cannot change my mind. I do feel charter cities are predatory. They are predatory to low-income countries, and they're not only looking for low-development countries that have weak institutions. As you presented in your PowerPoint, SEDES started after 2009. Honduras had their coup. They finally started building when Juan Orlando got reelected. Juan Orlando Hernandez, famously drug dealer, now in New York prison. But he had to take out the Supreme Court Justice of Honduras to finally get SEDES moving. So I understand theoretically, like the background of like, oh, you know, institutionally they're weak. But I have felt throughout my own lived experiences that they don't look for institutionally weak. They look where they can abuse institutions and gather as much money as they can. Because in Honduras, it wasn't necessarily just the Paul Romer model. There were all public-private associations. The one you work on, Ciudad Morazán, Prospera, and Prospera sued the Honduran state for $11 billion, right? Because they've been protesting since day one. I was there, my brother was there, my parents were there. Thousands of Hondurans said, no, we have a history. We were a banana republic. We had a history of like model cities not working in the country. And yet beyond the corruption of El Partido Nacional, they kept coming. And now we're seeing the outcome of this. Now they can't get their quick bag from the Honduran government anymore because the new government doesn't support them, and they're going to try and sue. So one comes, Prospera started, and I'm pretty sure more will come depending on what happens with Prospera. And we're a poor country. 11 billion. I wouldn't be here if my country had to pay 11 billion. I have loans from the state. I have loans from the private sector. I know I wouldn't be getting this degree if that would have happened before, right? Or my imagination. And even in the example of Ciudad Morazán, that $180 month rent is like around 4,000 empiras. And if it's in Sector Maquila, the average worker there only earns around 10,000 empiras. That's almost half their salary. I don't see, and then like another 20 for groceries, like a 30% to like survive, depending on their family size. I don't see where the development comes there. And that's like not my strong critique, but like, would you comment on that beyond my own bias soapbox speech? I can admit it. But yeah, that's it.
Sure. Yeah. So talking about Ciudad Morazán, yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, fair enough if that's, you know, higher than what a lot of people are making. I guess what I would say, right, let's set aside politics of Zeta just for a second and just think about Morazán just purely think of it as a housing project, just for a moment. I guess what I would say is that if it's opportunities for some people, and that some people can enjoy that seems like that's better than nobody gets to enjoy it. I think there's value in that. I think they're trying to figure out, right, how can we build this in a cost-effective way so that it's accessible to more people. And I suspect, just, you know, knowing, you know, the guy who's leading the project, that he is pretty squarely focused on, right, how can I push the price point of this down so that it becomes accessible for more people. So I guess I would say, yeah, maybe it's not perfect. But I would just say that it's creating additional opportunities that in the counterfactual don't exist at all. So I think there's something valuable gained there, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in to say something. So you said, I think, two things. One is that the experience Honduras had with charter cities was terrible. And I personally lean toward that as well. I'm not a big fan of how charter cities were implemented there. And I can see how, the people who had to experience all of that, they can see how charter cities are kind of the enemy. But there really isn't this, large agency in the world who's trying to find the places to exploit and establish charter cities. It's really just this more conceptual model of how to do development through special jurisdiction. And that can be implemented poorly and that can be implemented well. And it seems like in Honduras, maybe it was implemented poorly. But to give you the flip side, I'm Singaporean. If we didn't do something like that in Singapore, I probably wouldn't be here either. But that's sort of the other side of the coin. And the other thing he said was about the price issue of Moradon, which, yeah, that's substantially higher than someone low income in Honduras could afford. But I think that's a generalizable problem to real estate development. And I think a lot of times people look to real estate developers and they see the cost is high and they question how this is going to help a country. But I've worked with some of these developers and there is, whether you believe me or not, there is a sincere effort to bring the cost down. And it's just very difficult to do so to be a sustainable business. But one example I like is small farm cities. So when people think about building houses in the global south, a lot of times, the World Bank or the different multilateral institutions, they want you to build a place with plumbing. They want you to build a place with electricity. They want you to build a place with all of these utilities. And just in these countries, in a country like Malawi, you can't do that. It's not going to be affordable at all. You have to build somewhere that doesn't have some of these utilities, that doesn't have plumbing. The way small farm cities try to approach it is, yeah, let's build these houses that are modular. We won't put plumbing in the beginning, but over time, if people get more income, then they can start putting things in themselves. That's what the World Bank Sites and Services Project did as well. And so I think we can think of creative ways to kind of improve the private real estate model and to kind of connect it back to local prosperity. But I think that's just a constraint we have to face, that these firms need to profit. And unless we want to completely remove the private sector, which have the public sector do everything, we're going to need to contend with the profit problem. We need to figure out solutions around that.
Can I just add one additional point on the, right, how ZAs came into being, right? I would just say that I think a charter city law project, something like that, that comes into being in the way that ZAs did in Honduras, right? This sort of brute force kind of, right, really, right, constitutional, basically through a constitutional crisis moment, right? That's a really, really bad foundation for this type of project. If your charter city law is only an election away from repeal, right, which is what happened there. That's a really bad foundation. And so I think there's really something to be said, and it's underappreciated for generating broad political buy-in, such that, maybe it's not quite a 51-49 kind of issue, but that if you can create actually a much broader political social consensus that, this is something that we should do, we should try. I think there's real value in that. And that briefly takes me back to a comment from Professor Sanchez earlier, talking about, right, sort of local norms, tribal governance, these kind of things. That's something that I would actually really like to see more experiments of, is taking this special jurisdiction type approach and incorporating those elements into it in some way. I know of offhand of one tiny example that somebody was working on somewhere in the South Pacific, but I'd like to see more efforts like that works in tribal governance and more local governance into some of these projects that the people are trying. Oh, yeah, I didn't even think of that, right. Yeah, there's a tribe up in a First Nations tribe in Vancouver in Canada, is kind of a fun example of this. They basically have a really attractive parcel of land basically adjacent to downtown Vancouver. And because they're not bound by all of the regular Canadian zoning and planning laws and all of that, they're doing a super dense huge scale housing project. which is kind of I think a fun little example of how something like tribal governance can create some interesting opportunities in settings like these.
Yeah, so I think we are imminently getting kicked out of this room. So I'm sorry to cut off a very engaging discussion, but I'm going to invite the CCI folks will be upstairs on the first level. If people want to come and like have a little office hour and chat, we'll be around. And thank you so much to our panelists. This was great.
Come on. You want us to go protest with you?
Bring my glass. I need to burn a tire.